I'd like to talk about the Reformation. Now, when people think of the Reformation, usually they think of Catholics and Protestants. But actually, I like to say that there's three groups of the Reformation. Let me just introduce those to you. First of all, you have the Catholics. Those could be represented by the Reformation popes, Leo X, Clement VII, Paul III, Pius IV. Then you have the Reformers proper. That would be the big three: Martin Luther, Zwingli, John Calvin. And then you have this third category. And actually, scholars aren't agreed upon what to call them because they're a wide-ranging group of people as far as their belief systems are concerned. In fact, they're basically anybody who doesn't identify as a Catholic or a Protestant is looped or bunched into this third category. I call them the sectarians. The Anabaptists were one such group, but they're not certainly the only one, and their beliefs wasn't necessarily characteristic of all the rest of them either. So I think that's important for us to understand. It's just a very wide-ranging group of people. I'm going to look at several aspects of each one of these three categories of groups in the Reformation. We're going to look at their concerns, that is, what needed to change, and then their methodology, how to implement the change, their authorities, how to justify the change, and their goals. What did they want to achieve by their change? And then lastly, we'll look at the results that they produced. So first of all, the concerns with the Catholics. They were concerned about low morality amongst the clergy. That brought about the lack of confidence of the people in the Catholic Church. And that comes about really from the century before. In the 15th century, the Catholic Church was at a low ebb and lots of corruption and things going on that way. But what that did is that it brought a lack of prestige. Their respect was declining. And so people didn't have the awe and authority that they would have normally had to the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church certainly wanted to change that. They knew they needed reform. Number two, the Reformers. They saw wrong doctrines, particularly in regard to salvation and the gospel, and that what you had to do to believe and believe only and all that else. They also identified the wickedness of the church leaders, that they thought those were corrupt, and then the wickedness amongst their own church members, too. They wanted to clean that up, and they thought the presentation of the gospel would do that. The sectarians, again, this is a wide-ranging group, so it's hard to come up with one thing that characterized all of them, but certainly they would be upset with low morality amongst the clergy. Doctrine is also important to them too, not only salvation, but even how the composition of a church, the characteristics of the church, the marks of a church. Then of supreme importance to them was the behavior of their own church members. And so they wanted to make sure that that did change. And so that if there's something that characterizes many of them or most of them, that would be one of them. And then many of them also saw that a voluntary church system works best, where you're not coercing people to believe what the government wants or what the state leaders want or the church people want or whatever, but that people voluntarily join a church because they want to. Methodology, well, the Catholics practiced a top-down approach. The popes dictated to the hierarchy, through the hierarchy to the bishops that would then move down to the parish priest level, where they're cleaning up the morality, they're implementing the directives from the Council of Trent. And they also wanted to see that the state would be ruled over by the church dominating the state. Now, they had almost achieved that really several centuries before, and they wouldn't actually get to that in the 16th century, but they tried. I mean, that was their ideal goal, I guess you could say. The Reformers, they wanted actually sort of the opposite of the Catholics. They wanted the state to bring in the reform. Why? Because they would say the church was incapable of reforming itself. It was too corrupt. There was no way to do this, to get really the reform you needed, unless some outside entity did that. And so they wanted the state to really rule over the church. And really that was the mindset that both they and the Catholics shared, is that the state and the church cooperate in some way. You have to have that cooperation. You can't have a society without that. Now, that was dangerous for the Reformers sometimes, because if they suffered a military defeat in one of their Reformed cities, or if the region was defeated, well, then their Reformation in that area could just evaporate overnight. So there's a downside to that. The sectarians, they wanted no coercion at all. And so they didn't have the protection of the state because they never appealed to that, because they said that the church should be free from the state. Now, again, this is a wide-ranging group of people. Not everybody believed in that. But if you could characterize one thing that characterized a lot of them, or most of them, is that they wanted some sort of freedom from state interference. So some actually would even go a step further than that, say that a Christian should not have any involvement in the state at all. You can't be a magistrate, you can't be an elected government officer in any way, shape, or form. Now, the authorities each group used shows how they wanted to implement the reforms that they thought the church needed. So the Catholics, they appealed to the authority of the Pope, the authority of tradition, of course, and then precedents set by early church directives and councils in the past. The Reformers, they certainly used the Bible, very much so, especially for salvation. But in regard to the church-state relations or how to organize a society, they really look more towards the Old Testament. And again, they're looking from the perspective of a church-state cooperation, and there's a spectrum on that. But at least you could say that they couldn't envision a society without those two entities working together, and sometimes very, very, very closely. Also, they appealed to tradition. Sometimes they, would just didn't have biblical backing for that, but this is what they would appeal to, and they would say, well, if you don't go along with us, you're not participating in love like us, or you're not doing what we want, and so they would coerce too. But the truth is, tradition is strong amongst all of us, and so we all have to realize that influences us some way, shape, or form. But the Reformers oftentimes appealed to past precedent that way and the tradition that came to them. The sectarians, again, this is a wide-ranging group, so the authorities that many of them appealed to was the New Testament, because they would say the place you see churches talked about and discussed and defined is in the New Testament, so that's really what should guide you in as far as the society that you're building there, or the society or the worldview that you envision. Now, there were other subgroups amongst them too that did not share that view. One of them were the spiritualists, and so their authority was often an inner leaning or maybe the influence of the Holy Spirit in their lives that would, and sometimes, supersede the Bible in some of those groups, so that would say that they have this inner leading and that they have to obey that, and that's actually the ultimate authority for them. Goals. What were the goals that each one of them had? Well, the Catholics wanted a church-dominated state, and in years past, popes would put entire regions under the interdict so that they wouldn't perform any of the sacraments, and so those areas were really under the control of the Catholics then, because they wanted the sacraments to be practiced, and the Catholic Church would use that as a display of their sacramental power. The Reformers, they wanted a state-dominated church, which, again, was not always helpful, because some Reformers, because they lost elections or whatever, they would get exiled, like John Calvin or Martin Bucer. And then sometimes we were defeated in war, and then the whole reform would go back to Catholicism in some cases. But in any case, that's what they did. They tied the reform to the state. And then the sectarians, again, as I mentioned before, they wanted a free church liberated from control by the state. Let's talk about their results. Catholics before the Reformation were very weak. In fact, perhaps the weakest point they had ever been. There's a good argument you could make for that, especially in the 15th century. But as the Council of Trent continued throughout the various decades, they roared back. The Catholics roared back with restoring the confidence of the lay people in the Catholic Church. And by the end of the century, they really came back stronger than ever. And they actually used the next 3 centuries to convert the rest of the world to Christ, as far as their version of Christianity in the New World and other places like that, which is why they're very Catholic to this day. And then the Reformers, they didn't actually achieve the pure churches they expected the gospel to bring. Often their churches coerced people to believe a certain way, and that really undermined, I think, what they were trying to achieve. You could say today that state churches, particularly in Europe, are often dead churches. That is, they lack the vitality and vibrance and will to better themselves and really believe what the Bible teaches. And then the sectarians, they gathered themselves in voluntary congregations of converts that were free from the control of state authority, and that is passed down through various and sundry nonconformist groups throughout the years. And I think you could see the descendants, the spiritual descendants of many of these people, then became, through the nonconformist movement, part of the non-Catholic rise of the modern missionary movement at the very end of the 18th century and all throughout the 19th century, where they were raising funds and sending people out for missions. That really came through some of these nonconformist groups. In closing, I would just say the way we arrange our societies today in the Western world doesn't really follow the Catholic or the Reformed model. Rather, we follow the sectarian one. That is, they believe that people should follow their own conscience as far as what they believe in, and they shouldn't be coerced in any way.